Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to try to get started again. As we heard from Alejandro Moreno this morning, one of the number one issues on the minds of Mexicans and the Mexican public now and heading into, leading up to the elections in 2012 is the question of public security, violence, crime, and what their government is doing about it. We are exceedingly fortunate to have with us today two of the leading scholars on the issue of public security, rule of law in Mexico, and I'm delighted to introduce them here briefly. We'll start with a presentation by Dr. Arturo Alvarado from the Colegio de Mexico. No? They're undecided back here, but I'm
decided about it.
Yeah, you are decided. I'm in the middle, and I'm deciding. We're going to start with a presentation from Dr. Arturo Alvarado. How's that for decisiveness? From the Colegio de Mexico, I have to say, when I first started looking at the public security questions 15 years ago, Arturo's door was one of the first one that I knocked on at the Colegio de Mexico, and he's been looking at this problem not just recently as it's become more of a headline issue, but over many years. And so I'm delighted that he's here to be able to talk to us about public security. The other side of the coin, of course, is the rule of law questions, access to justice, how the justice system performs. And we are also joined by one of the leading thinkers, scholars on the justice system in Mexico, Dr. Ana Laura Magaloni from CIDAC, a well-known think tank in Mexico City. She's professor of law there and written extensively on the judicial system. And two, I've learned a great deal from her as well in this process. So we're glad to have them here. We're going to try to recoup the time we've lost here along the way in the conversation. I'm going to ask each of them to speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions. So let's start with you, Arturo.
Okay, 10 minutes of glory, and then we have lunch. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to start, since I'm going to start first, I'm going to start with a joke. And this is something that I remember just when I was in the morning in the panel. And the joke is, you might have heard this thing in several versions, but there is this meeting between three countries of different regions that are becoming democratized, that they have lots of trouble, and they go to see the goddess of democracy. And each one of them decided to ask the same question. And the question is, are we going to get democratized in our time? Yes or no? And one guy is from Asia, another guy is from Africa, and another guy is from Latin America. So the first one that goes and asks this question is the guy from Asia, and asks the goddess, am I going to become a modern country with a full win economy and full democratic rule of law government, yes or not? And he answered the question this way: yes, but not in your lifetime. Since this is about Mexico present and future, I thought the idea came out timely. Then the second one came and asked the same question. And the answer of the goddess say, yes, you will become democratic, but not in your lifetime. And then the last one comes in front of the goddess and asks the same question. And the answer is, yes, you are going to become a democratic modern country, but not in my lifetime. So from here on, what I'd like to talk a little bit is about a two-tale of the story that it has to do something about public security, but I will start by criticizing the mere idea of the public security. Because I think the problem doesn't have to really be addressed in this thing, and it has been wrongly addressed by years of mischievous activities by politicians intellectuals and other political important international actors in the arena of public security, justice, and the rule of law in Mexico. And this to tell story starts with one part of the process of what is happening in Latin America since the late 80s. By the late 80s, most of the countries, whether they were authoritarian countries, military dictatorships, or even constitutional democracies of some sort, or they were even quarreling about politics or fighting in internal wars or civil wars, they started to become more peaceful. They started to have important political arrangements and important political decisions among most of the elite members of each one of the countries, as well as among several important external actors. By the late 80s and early 90s, most of these countries decided to go into a process of political change. Some of them, like Brazil, went into a political agreement between the military and the financial and political elite, and decided to go on into an important process, even to a constitutional making process. And somehow, between and after that process, Brazil is stalled to have become democratic, fully democratic. And last November elections just show you the results of an important political process of an agreement among the elites. Colombia is the other case where a formally democratic country, a constitutional democracy in the best way of a definition, started to have strong problems about internal political agreements and also criminality. And by the late 80s, these problems started to become politically just about unsolvable. At the point that the so-called long-term process of violence in this country became just about what it was an undisclosed civil war. And from that, they went on in reforming their military, their police, and reorganizing the important issues into the political elites, and went into a constitutional process in 1991 that, in a way, produced a new political regime, but the violent processes did not finish even up to today. And the third country that came into this issue is Mexico. In between the late 90s, or the late 80s and the early 90s, Mexico went into a political change that was a more or less peaceful change and an agreement between the political elites. That by 2000 resulted in a shift. A different party that has been, a party that was not governing in Mexico for almost 70 years was able to win the presidential chair. And from that, they has been ruling the presidency for the last 10 years. The common path of these countries, or the paths of commonalities between these countries, are very few. Brazil was a military dictatorship. Colombia was a very close political elite, or a political regime with strong military participation in the state. And Mexico formally never was, after the late 30s, some sort of a military country. It was a one-party authoritarian country. Very different past, came out into a similar process of democratization, and they all came with a similar tribulation that we live every day in Latin America, in every single city and in the countryside. Violence. Criminality looks uncontrollable. There is no way all the policies that have been implemented for more than a decade are not working, because they are not working. The figures tell you that we have a deeper problem, and then from that we have to think about what is the root of this problem more than counting the bodies, putting police and soldiers into the fight of this thing, and developing new policies. And this is where I just want to point out into two ideas for discussion, more than going on into the idea of police reform, unitary or federal police, the military, yes or not, into the public security, and all these discussions that we've been having in Mexico as well as in Latin America. The core of the problem, for me, is the political arrangement between the elites in order to manage the two most important instruments of coercion in the states, which is the military and the police. No country in Latin America, with certain exceptions, if you would like to call the Chilean process, the Costa Rican in a different way, and partially the Argentinian, have been able to establish three aspects of the modern democratic state governance that is needed to really manage the violence in a different way. First is control of the military and the police. And I'm not talking about civilian control, I'm talking about democratic control of coercive forces of the state. The second is, and this is almost completely achieved, and when we talk about a democracy, we talk about democracy for the political elites, polyarchies. We have freedom of the press. We have free and fair elections, even though they are discussed. The legitimacy of certain processes have been disputed. And the third one is the rule of law. I'm going to limit the thing to the first two ones because I'm sure Ana Laura is going to talk a little bit more about the rule of law, but I just like to point it out, like the three main institutional features, since you like to be institutional in this discussion about this thing. Brazil looks like a strong case. A strong state, not a failed state. Nobody has been discussing that Brazil is a failed state during the last 2 to 3 years, that this work has been very popular in the policy areas of Washington as well as in intellectual areas in Mexico and other places. But still, Brazil has a strong autonomous military force, up to the point that the Constitution makes the military a guarantor of democracy. And not only that, that has made the military produce important endeavors into public or internal security, to the point that you can be looking at any website today or any newspapers in most of the important favelas in the, if you call the 15 or 20 major cities in Brazil, are having systematic military operations to get rid of favela gangs. Violence goes all the way through the basic urban everyday life in Brazil, and nobody calls the places not a democracy. Colombia has been going into a process of restoration, construction, reconstruction, negotiation, and has still not produced this important issue of civilian control of police and the military. And not only that, they still don't have control of non-state coercive actors. And from that, we can go into the Mexican case as much as you want. What is the problem? The problem is the political arrangements to organize and control violence, as well as the political elite is willing or able or unable to maintain the non-monopoly of coercion under a strict rule of law. We are not going to be able to cope with the violent processes that we are having in everyday life in Latin America. No matter how much money you put on that, no matter how well-trained your military or your police are, you are not going to resolve the everyday life, violent life of every single people or citizens in this country. On the contrary, you are going to be keeping these people disenfranchised and giving them no access to justice. Okay? So this is the first issue. Mexico, just to put the case, we've been discussing whether we need a national police or a federal police. We've been talking about that the local police is corrupt, inefficient, involving gangs, involving drugs, involved in everything. But nobody has really talked that much about how many of the political elite is also involved in criminal activities. Although we have some really good cases to talk about it, even candidates at different levels are suspiciously involved in criminal activities. Colombia had this problem to the point that the political elite has shifted during the last years, during the last 10 years, and they have even at the congressional level a representation of a third part of the Congress instituted and represented by what they were calling the paramilitares, the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, that they were able to mobilize. They mobilized, converted into a peace process, and then became the powerful political electoral elites of several regions in Colombia. And in Brazil, the issue of police abusive and also, criminal involvement of politicians is something that is not solved. So, in a way, one of the conditions of polyarchies, it's accomplished, but these polyarchies are not responsible to anybody. Accountability comes to be important. Second, and with this I will end, the issue of weaknesses of the state and institutional structures of the state. Why do I talk about these three countries? Brazil, as Mexico, are federal countries with strong institutional settings. Even though we can complain systematically about governors and the municipalities, there is no way we can produce a feasible constitutional amendment or reorganization of the state at local and state level that will make these governments, I wouldn't even talk efficient, governable. The municipal structure of Mexico that was built up since the first 1928 Constitution has the weaknesses that has not been solved for ages. The issue of tax revenue is just one of the most patent things. But from that you can go on and on and on. And then you have the federal state, or the states. Brazil and Mexico have strong federal states, but the interesting thing is that the political elites at the local level have all the incentives to use the resources, the revenue resources, for their own political goods, but have no single incentive to collect taxes or to collect their own rents in order to support their policies. So they don't have to respond for, getting the revenue. And oil is a really important and interesting thing in Mexico. Oil has become one of the main issues of political rent in Mexico. The second one is remittances. And we have, on the other hand, policies developed at the state and local level that are absolutely completely inefficient. And then you have this quarrel between the government, the president, and the Sistema Nacional de Seguridad Pública, where everybody gets together and claims that they're going to have, and they swear they're going to fight crime, and they say, we are going with you, president, in the war against drug lords. But when they go back to their offices, they just want the money, and then the problem becomes political. And that's where I want to start, to finish with. The problem is not only the organization of military or police forces, it's the necessity of reorganizing these three issues. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Ana Laura?
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I will focus on a very concrete problem. This is not, I'm not going to examine how crime rates are increasing in Mexico and why is this happening. I'm going to focus on a very concrete question, the reform of the Mexican justice system. And I will focus in two issues so as to frame and hopefully provoked a fruitful discussion. The first question is, why do we need this reform? What specific problems has to be solved? And the second question is, why is this reform an orphan in political terms? And why is there a lack of real implementation project in Mexico? To say that the Mexican criminal justice system doesn't work is not to say too much. We all know it doesn't work. The question that needed to be answered is why and how is this functional in concrete terms? My central hypothesis is that Mexico's criminal justice system is trapped in its authoritarian history. the bureaucratic inertias have been stronger than the country's political, social, and economic changes. Since the mid-80s, crime has grown and become more complex, and the political power become much more decentralized. In the face of these radical shifts, the criminal justice system has retained the old standard operating routines developed during the authoritarian regime. Predictably, this system, the criminal justice system, has become increasingly unable to function and to provide the population with the basic demand of safety and justice. This places the country's democratic governability at risk. Let me talk about what do I mean by the authoritarian criminal justice model. This model was premised upon two principles. The first one was an informal arrangement between the police and the criminals, based on the negotiation of impunity in exchange of information to prosecute a certain number of relevant cases. The second principle was an acceptance on the part of the system's operators, judges, prosecutors, that the police had a sort of blank check to obtain information using whatever means available. The key of the system was the police. It is possible to imagine that during the authoritarian regime, criminal cases were solved in three stages. The first one, the police obtained information to build the case by intimidating and even torturing witnesses and suspects. The second stage was the prosecutor's function was to provide the appearance of legality by putting together a file called averiguación previa that is a checklist of formalities which were in fact irrelevant but were used to simulate that the case had been legally investigated. And the third was the judge. The judge's role was to ratify the criminal indictment. He did not exercise any control over the arbitrariness, nor he was an impartial umpire between the accused and the persecutor. This model functioned very well in the context that had two characteristics. The first one was low crime rates. The second, high centralized power. In this context, a professional investigation and persecution system was not needed. What we really required was a system able to pose a believable threat of punishment of regime detractors or whoever defeat the powerful. So far, I have talked about the past. I will talk about the system today. During the many years I've done doing field work in the criminal justice system, in the prosecution office, the courts, jails, what seems evident to me is that really nothing makes much sense. Really, everything is upside down. The way in which I have been able to make sense of the nonsense is by imagining that what happens today in the justice system are the practice and routines from the old regime which operate in a complete opposite context. I mean, in a context of decentralized power and high criminal rates. Therefore, what one can observe in the working of the system today is the following. Let's start with the police. The all internal police discipline towards the head of the institution is broken, but police officers' capacity to negotiate the law and to maintain the state of impunity remains intact. As a result, the old impunity market that used to be centralized has become increasingly fragmented and disorganized. The second one, the prosecution, continues to performing the role and routines characteristic of the authoritarian era, namely, to discharge a succession of petty administrative tasks, who puts a file together called averiguación previa. This file, which is the centerpiece of the criminal procedures, is mainly an accumulation of formalities. In the method of averiguación previa, there is no attempt to put together a story based on evidence that explain how and who committed a crime. As in the past, judges continue to grant the cases to the prosecutor. Despite the low average quality of their work, prosecutors win 87% of the cases. Submissive and weak judges are a clear remnant of the old regime. The system has little capacity to investigate and solve complex cases. As a result, its impact on the prosecution of the worst crimes, kidnappings, homicide, rape, is extremely limited. According to the 3 inmate surveys that we've done in CIDAC, 2003, 2005, 2009, in Mexico City, 47% of the inmates were sentenced for not violent thefts, and 43% of them had stolen less than $30. Arbitrariness continues to reign supreme. There is not a sign of failure of the system. On the contrary, arbitrariness was designed to be the work method of the criminal justice system in the old regime. Today, according to the same surveys of CIDAC, 92% of the detainees were incommunicado during the police interrogation, 70% did not have a lawyer during that time, and 47%, they said, were beaten or mistreated by the police. Okay. On June 18th, 2008, an ambitious constitutional reform was approved. The reform seeks a complete transformation of the criminal justice system. It tends to shift from a written system to an oral one, from a system where a file is put together by fulfilling a series of formalities to one where the story of the case must be constructed, from an opaque one to one where the evidence is exhibited orally and openly before a judge. It tends to modify the role of each of the operators. With this reform, Mexico attempts to follow the footsteps of the majority of the countries in the region. I prefer to leave aside the technicalities of the reform. What I want to stress is that this reform seeks to break the grip of the authoritarian persecution model. That means, among other things, 2 very important ones: a police and a prosecution that cannot put together accusations using coercion, intimidation, and threats, but must instead develop investigation skills. And the second, a truly competitive trial, where the prosecution must present an hypothesis of the case and give evidence to support it, where the accused has a lawyer capable of presenting an alternative hypothesis, and where the judge is genuinely an impartial and independent referee. And this leads me to the center of the crossroad where the reform of the Mexican criminal justice system stands at the present. On one hand, the system has collapsed. It's incapable of investigating complex crime, and its results are completely unsatisfactory for the citizens. On the other hand, the shifts toward a new system organized around a competitive and open trial and a prosecution that investigates and builds cases does not seem to be politically attractive. I have 2 hypotheses on why there is no true political will to implement the 2008 constitutional reform. The first one is that if the criminal justice system becomes stronger and more professional, it will be a threatening in political terms. An effective reform will mean that the president and the governor will not have the ability to manipulate the criminal prosecution in favor of their political interest. The cases of Lidia Cacho and the governor of Puebla, the case of Montiel and his corruption scandals, or the absence of a credible federal and local investigation in the case of ABC, the daycare of Sonora, are clear examples of what a criminal justice system at the service of political means to the holders of the executive branch, local and federal. My second hypothesis is that in a context of high criminality, in political terms, it may seem irrational to bet on a higher performance standards of the prosecutor. Today, the prosecutor can coerce, isolate, intimidate detainees and witnesses, present poorly made accusations, and nevertheless win the case. Why make its job more complicated? What the political actors do not see is that thanks to all above, jails are populated by poor people who committed minor crimes, while the police receive monthly fees in exchange for not arresting car theft gangs or kidnappers gangs. The arbitrariness that used to work well in a context of high centralized power and low crime rates is utterly incapable of delivering security and any semblance of justice in a situation marked by this concentration of power and step rise in crime. Replacing arbitrariness with predictable and comprehensive rules and procedures is the only way out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me open it up first to the panel. If you have any comments or questions you'd like to add, and then to the general public. I think we're all stunned. Daniel Sabet. I need a microphone. Our microphone people have disappeared.
Second, Daniel. Daniel Smith, just wondering, I've done a decent amount of research in Chihuahua, and there the judicial reforms are viewed very poorly. And so you have this kind of situation where the old status quo looks really, really bad, and yet the new reform also looks pretty bad. How do you kind of reconcile those two differences?
Chihuahua is a terrible example, you know. It's impossible that a criminal justice system works well in the situation Chihuahua is. So I think it's the challenges of Chihuahua are not the challenges of the reform in Mexico. I think we should try that reform in Nuevo León or maybe another important state, but Chihuahua is a mess. I mean, no criminal justice system can stand the violence. It's almost a civil war going on in Chihuahua. But nevertheless, if you talk with the NGOs, they believe there are certain things that the reform has improved. But it's so sad what's happening in Chihuahua, and I think it's terrible that precisely in that state the reform started. So we are very confused about which are the benefits of changing the system. And very soon, the system collapsed again.
Can I follow up just really quick on
sure.
that? Just to push a little bit more. I mean, it seems like, I mean, on the one hand, yes, the organized crime thing is a challenge too big. On the other hand, there seems to be some pretty general concerns and criticisms, even in the areas not affected by organized crime, and a perception that many people are being arrested for car theft, for things unrelated to organized crime, and yet going free because they're going through the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, and they're being, and there's this sense that the reform was implemented to save money. And that you have these kind of two. It wasn't really implemented to improve the quality of justice in the state, but to decrease the numbers of people in the jails. And so the kind of the battle for perception, even putting aside the organized crime thing, is, I feel like in Chihuahua, is being lost. And I don't know if.
I agree with you, but no, This is very strange, is that we want to blame the system for what's going on in Chihuahua, and not, well, what about the military in the streets and the police and the federal police in the streets? And what about many other things? You know, it's easy to blame the system. I don't think the system, any system, could function in the situation that Chihuahua is. But you are right. It's a battle for perception. That's why we have to shift the discussion to a different state. Really, I believe that. If we want to talk about the reform.
Arturo, do you have a comment? Okay, Diana had a question here, and then I have a question from, I believe, from somebody online, right? Or, I mean, on the web. But go ahead, Diana, go ahead.
Ana Laura Magalani. I wish to bring up two other states, Campeche and San Luis Potosí. The first week of December, I spent a full week with young prosecutors, fiscales, and young judges from those two states who came to the state of New Mexico for training in the reformed criminal procedures. The dedication of those young men and women, they're in their early 30s, maybe some as old as 40, but they are a new generation. Their dedication to make the reformed procedures work, and their willingness to work from 8:30 in the morning to 6:30 in practicing open trials, collecting evidence, presenting their evidence, use of hearsay rules, was an eye-opener for me. And so from all the skepticism which us oldies and I have held, I recognize a new movement in Mexico to make the new criminal justice procedures work. Thank you.
I'm so happy to hear that.
Did you want to add a comment? We had a question from, I believe, from the web-based audience. So I'll just read it here to Ana Laura. Is Mexico still sending people to train in torture at the School of the Americas?
To train at torture.
I guess the first question is, does Mexico send military people to train in the United States at the School of the Americas, which is now the Western Hemisphere WINSEC?
I don't know. I don't know about the militaries, where they're trained, but I suppose there has been some training.
You?
There is training. There has been always training. The figures are there. Maybe there is also secret batch that we have no idea whether they are going. But you can even request it both to the United States government and to the Mexican government by the Freedom of Information Act in each country. So there is information, and they do. Yeah.
Okay. We had a question back there. I think my eyes may be fooling me, but that might be Howard Rard back there. And then there's a question here as well. So why don't we take 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll have to stop it there because we're really running low on time. Howard, right here, and then you can go.
Yeah, your eyes were correct. It is. I am in the shadows back here. Let us think comparatively for a moment and not parochially. The really interesting question to me in this present context is, could Mexico become another Tripoli, another Tunisia, another Egypt? The really interesting question is, why is it unlikely that we're going to see that kind of street violent revolutionary upheaval, I would guess, anywhere in Latin America? What has changed over the last 40 or 50 years or so to make that unlikely? Perhaps all the panelists could address that issue.
The young woman right here, you had a question? No? Or am I missing? Yeah. Oh, right behind you. Okay.
Hi, this is for anyone up there who might want to answer, but I've been reading a lot of different opinions about the base de datos de ejecuciones. So I just was...
What? The presidencia?
Yeah, the base de datos, the database.
The new database provided by the president.
Right. So I was just
President's
kind of interested in hearing opinions on what you think, if it's useful, its veracity, how that is planning to be used in the context of reforming the justice system or looking to kind of solve some of the crimes that are going on.
And you right here? Can you?
Yes, Blanca Heredia, Georgetown University. I think that what was presented by Ana Laura Magaloni was really extraordinarily useful, and it brings light to an issue that we often talk about, but I don't think we've really have had the words and the minute, detailed information as to the nature of the system and how it works. And I first want to say that, and I think it is extremely important. Secondly, I know from her work that she's also identified some of the changes that we need to see in the way the prosecution, both the prosecution and particularly the judges perhaps, might need to go through in terms of the new kinds of skills and that they would need to develop in order for the system to work. So I would like to ask Ana Laura to, in addition to pointing, she's already pointed to some of the central political problems that the implementation of the reform faces. Let's suppose that you would find a governor, say, with the political will to carry out the reform. What would you tell that governor that he would need to do, and what kinds of skills would you need to develop in your judges and your operators more generally for the reform to be successful? Because I think what Daniel was pointing out to is, and some of the recent cases that we've seen and you've discussed and have been discussing in the press should lead us to develop the kinds of arguments that we're going to need to defend the reform.
Yes.
Otherwise, we're going to have one more victim, not only like these women, for instance, or all of these human victims, but we might also have another victim, which is this possibility of reform.
Great. Ana Laura?
Well, to answer Blanca's question, it's a long question to answer, but what I think the basic advantage of the system, of the new system, is that places the story in the middle of the system. We are discussing who is guilty and who is not guilty with no story. Nobody is giving us that explanation, what happens and why this person that the persecutor is accusing is guilty of. So as soon as you put the story in the middle of the system, the way you discuss the evidence is so different. And even in this terrible case of Rubio, what I've seen is an open discussion of what was in there and which were the evidence that support the accusation. And today, if you really try to get into a criminal case in Mexico, you will have to read I don't know how many pages of irrelevant information, and you really cannot follow. And nobody can understand why you are accusing or not accusing somebody. So I think the kind of communication that the system will have with the citizens is very powerful, even if they failed, like in Rubio's case. Even if it's a terrible decision, we all understand and we discuss in a different way what the system should behave and what is the power of the judges and how the prosecutor should construct their accusation. So the new skills are really the opposite of what they've been doing. So if I recommend something to the governor, it would be more or less what you saw. Young people. Train young people. Get rid of the old ones. Try to I'm sorry? Yes, I know. I know. But what I've seen in Latin America, the more successful reforms are those that can built up in a new generation of lawyers. And the very basic point of success is people, human resources, more than any other thing. I mean, you can invest in computers, courtrooms, whatever, but if you don't invest in the kind of people that operates the system, you may not have any result. The inertia from the past is terrible. It's so heavy. So you really have to make a fresh start, or try to handle it try to maximize your possibilities of a fresh start, not to. The story of the institution is very, very heavy for the new operators.
Arturo, do you want to comment on the Banco de Datos or Howard's question about is Mexico going to be the next Tunisia? Or I want to ask.
We're not going to be the next Tunisia because we are not overthrowing a president to begin with. Okay, so that's the first thing. And I don't think we're going to be overthrowing the next president because we like elections. Yeah. And we're going to have one in 2012. And I'm sure whether the result is good, bad, or disputed, the next one is going to be able to get there. That's my best bet. Other than that, there's been a discussion in the literature as well as in the policy arenas here, specifically in the United States and in Washington, about failed states. And Mexico has become the threat of this thing. Is Mexico a failed state? Is Mexico losing sovereignty? Is Mexico has no control of most of his territory? Yes, maybe that's the case, but in the 19th century that was everyday life. After the revolution and during the revolution, it was like this way. There was no monopoly of coercion by the state. That was this idea, this Bavarian idea of the monopoly of legitimate state coercion is an ideal typology that does not exist in most of modern states, except for the old states built up to the 19th century. And even today, this issue is more disputed because of globalization and other trends. One important, illegal activities and organized crime. And so that's one thing. The second, just for the database, I haven't dig into the database. It's not bad. I just look at this thing. I just want to mention a couple of discussions that are interesting about these databases and everything. For instance, there is new independent information about this topic, whether it is good, bad, or horrible. There is one. For instance, Reformas Ejecutómetro. It's an interesting thing. Because you can dispute whether the figures are real or not with them, or whether the government is saying the truth about how many people was killed in a confrontation in Colonia del Valle yesterday or not. So there is public information beyond the government now, so that's good news. There are several other data. There is a strong dispute among specialists with the government about redesigning the databases and using international standards, which is good. It's going to happen. We're going to have better databases one of these months or years. But I just want to go on into just point out a discussion that was already set up at the beginning with him about the issue of security in the region. And that one of the conditions of integration or improving the markets and improving the economies and the societies will be to start having a North America discussion about security. And this is an interesting issue because this really goes beyond whether Mexico is a failed state or not. I mean, what is the future of this issue? What are we going to do with this thing? We're going to have to confront it. The United States already has a policy, a new hemispheric policy, that is being implemented step by step. Mexico has not been able to really produce a substantive idea about how to integrate or dispute this new policy. I think we as Mexicans, we should have an open public discussion and thing. And second, we should start having trilateral discussions about this thing. We should discuss and evaluate Plan Mérida. What is going on there? What are the future of this? What kind of policy arrangements we can do by the three countries if we really want to do that thing? And through that, then we are going to have to discuss some other issues like illegalities, illegal markets in the three countries, immigration. for fitness, piracy, human trafficking. We had to address it in a very different way. So that's just to posit it here. And that's an important political issue. And then I will end with this thing. I mean, it's just what I want to insist. I mean, as far as we don't, in Mexico, we don't get into a further discussion about how to organize the forces, the state coercive forces, in order to really produce a substantive policy against crime, whether this is treaty or organized crime, we are not going to solve the problem of criminality and violence that we are having in everyday life. Yeah?
You're setting the table well for the discussion this afternoon on Mexico's foreign policy and how it relates to not only the United States but its neighbors to the south, which I think is increasingly on the agenda. I am going to, unfortunately, have to pull the plug here a little bit. I don't know if Alejandro or others on the panel, Luis, want to have any last comments on this topic, and then we'll break for a quick lunch and move into our final panel.
Just a quick comment. I don't know if Mexico is a far more complex country than Tunisia. Certainly, I'm not sure about Egypt, but certainly than Tunisia. Maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there would have been grounds for some kind of uprising, though not of a similar type. Today, that's simply inconceivable for reasons that Alvaro mentioned and others. There is no authoritarian system to topple. People are betting on elections. Mexicans don't want violence, even though there is violence on the streets. They don't want political violence, and that's something we don't have or we haven't had. And maybe most important, the issues that we are airing here, and one argument that Laura just mentioned, suggests that people are trying to build, or people in all walks of life, government and private sector, people in the streets, are trying to fix problems, to find ways of solving them, and that is in stark contrast with what's happening in those Arab countries. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. There will be an opportunity to talk to folks informally in the hallways. I know there were a lot of other questions here. I think we're going to break for 15 minutes to grab some lunch. Please bring it back in here. And we'll get our next panel going right away. Thank you all very much.